now the margins of both the French Enlightenment and of our course together, our final lecture on naturalism and materialism, the boundaries of the French Enlightenment. For atheistic materialism is one of the dramatic legacies among many of the French Enlightenment, and though a circumscribed and narrow current of Enlightenment thought, one that, like Rousseau's current, will have a very dramatic history and future in Western civilization. The 18th century, to contextualize the emergence of a categorical naturalism and materialism from the Enlightenment, is an age of increasing naturalist, mechanistic explanation in natural philosophy, in what we would call substantive science. If you ask an 18th century physicist, deist or Christian, why does a stone fall? Why does a river flow? The answer to those questions will be given in terms of the properties of mass, the laws of motion, the laws of mechanics, the laws of hydrodynamics. If you talked about the demon moving the stone, the spirit of the river, 18th century natural philosophers, Christian or deistic, would laugh at the nature of such a superadded explanation. In practice, in 17th century and in 18th century new philosophical science, in practice, we see the elimination of concepts of spiritual causality from physical phenomena. If an 18th century Christian or deist asked the question, why were the crops not higher this year? By saying God willed shorter crops, rather than in terms of rainfall or in terms of fertilization, an 18th century Christian or deist would say, aha, don't know much about crops or about agriculture, do you? In the Aristotelian worldview in the early 17th century, the motion of the planets in their orbits was explained in terms of angelic intelligences that guided them, allowing them to keep perfect and, at that time, presumed circular orbits. By the 18th century, explanation of the motion of the planets in terms of guiding angelic intelligences, rather than in terms of the laws of motion, gravity, and astronomy, would have sounded risible indeed. In the 17th century, the followers of René Descartes, whom we call the Cartesians, had even brought animal life under the concept of natural, mechanistic, physiological explanation. Originally, many theologians found it dangerous, if not heretical, to explain animal behavior in terms of physiological phenomena. But increasingly, theologians became sympathetic to such explanations of animal behavior because it seemed to eliminate human beings who could only be explained in terms of their rational, free, spiritual souls, so far above animals whose behavior we could explain operationally in terms of a mechanistic physiology. But now, note the implication of what we've just said. The 18th century would have laughed at an explanation of the difference between giraffes and ants in terms of their different souls. A giraffe does what it does, an ant does what it does because of the qualities of the giraffe soul and the qualities of the ant soul. That would have been seen as an ignorance of physiology, of natural history, of natural explanation. You don't say a giraffe spirit accounts, or an ant spirit, or a river spirit, or a planet spirit accounts for the behavior of those things. But they do not laugh when such explanations are made in terms of the human being. There is one profound anomaly, or one profound limit to the 18th century's willingness to naturalize and mechanize explanations of behaviors. What makes human beings the unique creatures they are? What accounts for human behavior? Here, almost all 18th century thinkers insist it is not physical properties or physical differences that explain human differences from other creatures, but possession of an immortal and immaterial soul, a human spirit, a man spirit. Without that, no thought, no will, no sin, no human behavior. Human beings, then, in operational 18th century explanations, were physical bodies directed by a spiritual soul. It produces certain dilemmas. Why the same behaviors in animals should be described as reflexes and in humans as decisions of an immaterial soul. So the case of human beings sets one dramatic limit to the 18th century's willingness to naturalize, materialize, generalize explanation. But note that I kept talking about operational explanation, because naturalism, that this whole universe that we observed could be explained solely in terms of matter in motion, had always been the greatest specter of disbelief to the Western theistic, God-believing, Christian or deist, European mind. And while the science of human life remains operationally spiritualized in terms of concrete explanations of concrete phenomena, in terms of the broadest philosophical perspectives, in terms of metaphysical philosophy, in terms of what one thinks underlies the reality that we observe, the 18th century still seeks to preserve a general supernatural and spiritual reality within which physical explanation can occur. And indeed, building on the new philosophy inherited from the 17th century, wants to preserve a general model, if not a set of particular explanations, in terms of spiritual and generally divine causality. For many, the need for spiritual or divine agency arises from the very notion of matter in Newtonian physics, that matter, that mass is inertial. At rest, it remains at rest. At motion, it continues in motion. From which many conclude that if mass is inertial, that matter is indifferent to motion or rest, and thus cannot be the cause of its own motion. At rest, it remains eternally at rest, such that the cause of motion in nature must originally have a non-material, an immaterial, a spiritual or divine source, a first mover, God as spirit. For many 18th century minds, it's as if we're born into the midst of a very complicated billiard shot that you see after the person with the cue has left. You can study its mechanics. You can explain where the balls are going by the laws of physics alone. But you have to infer the existence of something not a billiard ball that first set that motion into being. Secondly, thinking in terms of general, broad philosophy. The 18th century must deal not only with the acquired motion of things that move because other things have touched them and communicated motion, but also with what it calls spontaneous motion. That is to say, you can push a dog, that's one kind of motion, or a sleeping dog can wake up, rise, and walk away. That's spontaneous motion, very different from a billiard balls. You can throw a plant, that's acquired motion by the plant. Or a plant can grow from within. That is spontaneous motion. Animals, plants, living things not moved in a billiard ball model of the communication of motion. How do we conceptualize life, living things? For so many who don't want to explain particular phenomena on the basis of spiritual causal agency, it nonetheless follows for them that the existence of spontaneous motion indicates a permeation of living matter by something immaterial. A spirit of life and spontaneous motion, animal and vegetable in one sense, of which the human is one required for specific explanations. Why do I move my hand to the right rather than to the left? By an act of my immaterial will. A plant grows in ways that we can chart, that we can study naturally, but the very fact of growth for so much of the 18th century informs us of a spiritual reality in the world. So that if not at the level of particular, at the level of general metaphysical understanding and explanation, when the 18th century asks, can we conceive of this material world in terms of its manifest, natural, material properties alone? The answer is no. The problem of motion, acquired and spontaneous, leads us towards spirit and God. And the whole phenomenon of human behavior leads us to recognition of an immaterial soul. Now one can understand the drama of the title of a work published in France in 1748 by an Enlightenment physician and materialist by the name of La Mettrie, L-A-M-E-T-T-R-I-E, entitled The Human Machine, or Man a Machine, in French, L'Homme Machine. La Mettrie insists that there is a fundamental either-or in science, including the science of mankind. That we are either materialists or we are spiritualists. If we adopt spiritualism for La Mettrie, it is an admission of ignorance. It is a dead end. Attribute a phenomenon to spirit, and there is no further natural human inquiry. It is an abandonment of the possibility of knowledge, predictability, and control. Attribute illness to soul, and you cease looking for a material medicine of human behavior. Attribute mental illness, attribute behavioral disorders to a soul, and you abandon the pursuit of natural knowledge. And the analogy for La Mettrie is that if one says crop failure or livestock death is an act of spirit, of witchcraft, of demons, of things immaterial, you lose the possibility of knowledge, science, predictability, control. Materialism as a strategy, even more than as a set of metaphysical claims for La Mettrie, invites us to set no boundaries to human knowledge. It allows for the patient acquisition and search for laws, mechanisms, control, a human medicine writ large over all of human behavior. The strongest argument against this position, he notes, is that we have a soul separate from, independent from our body. We have an immortal, immaterial soul. But everything in the life sciences, La Mettrie argues, demonstrates that there is one physical unity of what we think of as bodily and mental phenomena. Illness changes our thoughts. Physical drugs change our thoughts. Sexuality changes our thoughts. Speeding up or slowing down the circulation of the blood changes the will, changes the thoughts. Foods, body temperature, hunger, old age, the flow of blood to the brain, all of this indicates that mind is a behavior of body, not an independent entity. The behaviors that we identify as requiring a spiritual soul beyond natural scientific inquiry to account for all have physical bases of behavior. Speech is related to specific physical structures. The senses shape our thought. Animals do communicate with each other. The deaf and dumb don't lack spiritual qualities by which they cannot translate their thoughts into words. They suffer physical disabilities. And indeed, through medicine, through surgery, can be made fit to talk, can learn to talk, and that is not infusion of soul. It is understanding human phenomena as arising from physical basis. Don't limit the resources of material nature without inquiry. For La Mettrie, the transition from animals to men is not categorical. It is a gradual transition. Dissection indicates that complex behaviors correlate with increased complexity of the physical brain and of the central nervous system. The more complex the brain, the more complex the memory, the learning, the ability to distinguish, the ability to compare. We are working from a model drawn from billiard balls and physics when we should be studying the living world around us, and we would learn that matter is not dead and inert and dependent upon spirit to move. Matter is alive. Look at the life sciences, La Mettrie invites. Haller has shown muscular irritability after death. How could that be if bodily motion is only due to the presence of spirit? Tremblay has discovered the polyp. Divide it in two, it regrows. Divide it in 4, it regrows into 4 polyps. Divide it into 16, it regrows into 16 polyps. But the soul is indivisible. How could that be? Don't limit the resources of living nature. We inject saline solution into the heart muscles after death, and they move. What we call soul is not the cause of the body's movements. It is the effect of the body's movements. And what moves us is the physical energy of our organs, not their spirit. In La Mettrie's metaphor, the body is not a watch moved by the soul, but, quote, a clock whose clockmaker is food, end quote. For La Mettrie, nature is alive and vital, capable of thought, of motion. Nature has formed machines, organisms, mechanisms capable of the behavior of thought. It is not coincidence that pressure on the brain causes the inability of conscious thought. It is because we are one organism of which thought is a behavior. The work of Denis Diderot and other French materialists later in the 18th century will build dramatically upon the foundations laid by La Mettrie. For Diderot, all nature is potentially alive, sensitive, organic. The organic-inorganic distinction is not categorical, and every piece of matter may move from one mode to the other. Challenged in a dialogue, he writes, but the difference between that statue of a man and the man is a categorical distinction. And Diderot says, I can change one into the other. How, he's asked. First, I grind up the marble statue into a fine dust. And then I add water. And then we let it sit. Will you give me hundreds, thousands, millions of years of time? And then into the humus formed by that marble and water, a purely physical event. I plant seeds, a purely physical event. And the seeds draw up the nutrients of the marble, a purely physical event. And we feed the legumes produced from that to a human mouth, a purely physical event. And it enters the stomach, a purely physical event, and is digested, a purely physical event. And then the nutrients of that marble become heart, brain, flesh, hands, eyes of the human being. And I transform the statue into the living being, body, thinking brain of a human. All nature is capable of sensation for Diderot via material catalysts and organization. Natural processes are the root of explanation, and explaining such things by the God hypothesis, as Diderot calls it, is offering no explanation at all. Nature for Diderot is a vital force, generating countless material forms, some of which survive, some of which evolve into new forms. Blind matter without purpose in an endless cycle of decomposition, reformation, emergence of new forms, life, death, survival, provide the variety of an ever-changing, kaleidoscopic world of which we are an ephemeral moment. Life and death are two modes of matter in a certain physical state. I think, I will, I breathe. In another physical state, that same matter becomes the elements of the earth. The critical dimension for Diderot that has limited our science is time, for we limit ourselves to the 6,000 years of biblical time and say, where is the evolution? Where is the variety? By that same criterion, we could look at canyons and say they had to have been created by God because water can't erode something that deeply in only 6,000 years. But if we abandon the arbitrary criterion of scriptural time for Diderot and posit millions, if not hundreds of millions of years, then the evolution, survival, disappearance of nature's cornucopia of new forms can account for all. Human thought is a mystery, Diderot argues, but it is a scientific, not a theological mystery. Saying soul doesn't explain it any more than it would explain crop growth or livestock death. Human thought is a scientific mystery, but we already know enough to see that it correlates to and emerges from complex organization of brain. Is God playing a physical joke that thought is the product of spirit? But there is a correlation between thought and the complexity of physical brain as observed by anatomy. It's an absurdity. It's a non-explanation for Diderot. The future understanding of human cognition and will lies in brain physiology and the study of the central nervous system, not in dead-end theological explanations. From this, it follows for Diderot that there is no extra human moral dimension whatsoever to the world. That ethics as well are a behavior of the physical organism. Good and evil as ideas are merely responses of the organism to the natural world. Our only ethic is we seek what is agreeable and useful. We flee what is disagreeable and harmful. But if we abandon spiritualism and the God hypothesis for Diderot, then without apology, we work toward the creation of a human ethic in which we understand that we are linked to a nature that does not care for us, one way or the other, that is indifferent to our fate, and that we only have the light of our natural knowledge to guide us. In one of his most celebrated metaphors, Diderot writes, imagine someone walking along in an impenetrable dark forest, holding a small lantern in front of him that gives off a little bit of light by which he sees. Along comes someone and says, it's so dark, blow out the light. That man, Diderot writes, is a theologian. With our little bit of light in nature to guide us, we may pursue by natural means that happiness toward which by our nature we tend, but which depends not upon wish, not upon prayer, not about what we would hope to be true about the universe. Our fate, our happiness depends upon our real ability to coexist or not with nature as it actually is. No force will aid us. No tablets are written anywhere. We must, by truth and adaptive behaviors, create a human life as close as possible to the desires of the human heart for happiness and ease from pain. Almost all believers will look upon atheism and materialism as a horrific human arrogance from the self-perspective of the materialists, from their own self-image. It is the theological and spiritual community that arrogantly claims a knowledge we do not have about the ultimate nature of things. And it is atheistic materialism that offers an honest humility, that says there is so much we do not know, but where we do not know, we cannot make up answers. In the atheistic materialist self-image, there is a sense of living with wonder at a nature that awaits our exploration and our science, but that also lives with a certain sense of the humility, with a certain humble sense of the ephemerality of human life as we know it, of this moment of cosmic history. It puts an end in its own mind to a static model of nature, a solar system that will always be this way, suns that will never extinguish themselves, forms of life that will never change or be extinct. Nature is a dynamic, creative force, and we live between a past and a future which need not resemble each other. In the system of the materialists, knowledge is bound to experience, and our only experience is of a material world. Theology is nothing but an admission of ignorance. The atheist Baron Dolbach, a dear friend of Diderot, will define theology as, quote, the ignorance of natural causes reduced to a system, end quote. Mechanism and determinism may not be categorically demonstrable by philosophical means, but they do seem confirmed by existing science that we may know the laws, the mechanisms, the governing operations of nature. And they are not only our best, they are our only model and chance for useful understanding. The atheists as well make no moral apologies. They claim that the God of both Christians and theists is a being as depicted by the believers themselves, morally inferior to human beings. What human would allow a child to die in pain if it could be prevented? What human would allow a child or an innocent to go over a cliff to his or her death? What will you say, someone asked Dolbach, if you are wrong and you stand before God on Judgment Day? And Dolbach wrote, what I would answer is, how dare you did this? How dare you did that? And that moral side of their atheism is a dramatic part of what the French materialists are all about. The only love we experience is the love of human beings for human beings. The only pity we experience is the pity of human beings for human beings. In a universe that does not care for us, we must coexist with nature and adapt and seek to build a human happiness. Their own system, they conceded, could not be demonstrated philosophically and needed to be judged by their own criterion. Since one could not prove an ultimate system of the world philosophically, one had to judge philosophical systems on the basis of whether or not their consequences were productive of human happiness or suffering. Learn systematically from nature. Apply that knowledge to gain mastery of the natural world, and one has done the most that a human mind can do.